Welcome to Daily Life in the Past. Here, we explore how ordinary people lived before modern technology and comfort shaped everyday life. If you enjoy learning about the past, feel free to leave a comment and let us know where you are watching from. And if you would like to support the channel, a like or subscription is always appreciated. Food has always been more than fuel. In many past societies, what people ate, how much they ate, and how they ate it were public signs of rank. Food also showed who had protection, who had choices, and who was forced to live close to hunger. In modern life, people often think of food as a personal preference. In older worlds, food was tied to land, taxes, labor, religion, and government power. Most people could not simply buy what they wanted, because markets were smaller, transport was slow, storage was limited, and the risk of crop failure was real. This made food one of the clearest markers of privilege. This video explains how food reflected social status across major historical settings. It also explains how food inequality worked as a system, through ownership of land, control of trade, rules about consumption, and public institutions that manage scarcity. To understand food and status, it helps to begin with one core fact. In many agricultural societies, a large share of ordinary people's calories came from one main staple. That staple might be wheat bread, rice, millet, maize, potatoes, or oats. The elite also ate the staple, but their status showed in what came with it: meat, fish, dairy, wine, oils, spices, sweets, and the variety and frequency of these foods. Status showed not only in the menu but in reliability. A powerful household could store grain, buy food even when prices rose, and use connections to avoid shortages. A poor household could be pushed into hunger by a single bad harvest, a job loss, a rent increase, or a local price spike. One way to think about historical food inequality is to separate it into 4 layers. First is production, who controls the land, water, herds, and labor that create food. Second is distribution, who controls storage, transport, marketplaces, and taxation. Third is consumption rules, religious fasting, social customs, and sometimes laws that told people what they were allowed to eat. Fourth is crisis response, what governments, landlords, temples, or charities did when food ran short, and who received help first. Across time, elites tended to control all 4 layers. Start with production. In many pre-industrial societies, the majority worked in farming. Yet land ownership was unequal. A small elite, nobles, big landlords, temples, state officials, wealthy clans, often controlled the best land. Many others farmed as tenants, serfs, or smallholders with heavy obligations. This mattered because land is not just a place to grow food. Land is also the main source of surplus. Surplus is what allows a person to live without farming, to keep servants, to host guests, to give gifts, to support soldiers, and to build political influence. In many eras, high status meant that other people's labor produced your food. Food inequality also came from taxation. Taxes were often paid in kind, grain, oil, wine, livestock, or labor time. This moved food from villages to storehouses and capitals. The center could then feed armies, officials, and city populations, while the countryside carried the burden. In that world, hunger was not always caused by an absolute lack of food. Often it was caused by access. Food existed, but the poor could not claim it. They lacked money, they owed rent or tax, they had debts, or they were cut off by war or policy. Now consider what people actually ate. For many working families, daily meals were built around inexpensive staples and simple cooking methods. Bread, porridge, pottage, rice gruel, or boiled grains could be stretched to feed many mouths. Legumes like beans and lentils mattered because they offered protein at lower cost than meat. Vegetables were important where they could be grown, but seasonality was a constant limit. Freshness could be rare in winter or dry seasons. Meat is one of the most common status markers in historical diets. That is not because ordinary people never ate meat. Many did sometimes, especially where they kept pigs or chickens or where fish was available. But frequent, varied, high-quality meat, especially from large animals, was usually expensive. There were several reasons. Raising livestock requires land for grazing and fodder. That land could otherwise grow grain. If a society is close to subsistence, converting grain into meat is costly. Meat also spoils quickly without modern refrigeration. That increases waste and raises costs. Hunting rights and forest access were often controlled by elites. In many places, the best game was protected by law or custom. So, for elite households, meat was not just food. It was a sign that they controlled land, animals, and labor, and that they could afford waste. Another strong marker was whiteness and refinement. In many grain cultures, whiter flour required more milling and sifting. That extra work raised cost. White bread, fine pastries, and delicate noodles often signaled higher status, while darker breads and coarser grains were linked to lower status. Sugar and spices also worked as status markers. In many historical periods, these were imported goods, tied to long-distance trade, colonial systems, and heavy labor. For an elite table, sweet desserts, spiced sauces, and sugared drinks showed wealth and global connections. Alcohol, too, could signal rank. Wine, especially good wine, often cost more than small beer or simple fermented drinks. Drinking practices, who drank what, in what vessels, and in what settings, often followed strict social lines. But food status is not only about luxury items. It is also about stability. In many times and places, the poor spent a large share of their income on the staple, often bread or grain. When prices rose, they could not easily substitute. If most of a family's budget goes to the staple, a small rise can cause crisis. Meanwhile, elites could absorb price changes, diversify foods, and draw on stores. This difference shaped social tension. Food markets were not seen as morally neutral in many older societies. Communities often believed there should be a just price for essentials. When merchants were suspected of hoarding or exporting grain during scarcity, people sometimes protested or rioted. These were not only desperate acts, they were also arguments about justice and obligation. Now look at the relationship between food and power in cities. Cities often depended on the countryside. Large urban populations could not feed themselves without steady imports of grain. This made urban food supply a political issue. In Imperial Rome, for example, the state organized a large grain supply system and provided a grain dole to a large number of registered citizens. This was both welfare and politics. It helped prevent unrest in a crowded city. It also reinforced the idea that the state and the emperor were providers. Food support systems often had rules about who counted as deserving. In Rome, the grain dole was tied to citizenship and registration, which meant that outsiders and many poor residents could be left out. This is a common pattern. Food assistance can reduce suffering while still reflecting social hierarchies. Outside of state systems, religious institutions often played major roles. Temples, monasteries, and charitable foundations could store grain, distribute bread, or operate public kitchens. In the Islamic world, for instance, endowments could fund soup kitchens that served the poor. These institutions were important, but they did not erase inequality. They tended to help at the margins, especially in cities, while the deeper structure of land ownership and taxation continued. Religious rules also shaped status in complex ways. Fasting and food restrictions could, in theory, apply to everyone. Yet the wealthy often had more options within the rules. If meat was forbidden on certain days, the rich could replace it with expensive fish, seafood, and elaborate dishes. The poor might replace it with simpler foods, or they might have had little meat to begin with. Religious calendars could also change markets. Demand for fish during fasting seasons could raise prices, making certain foods less accessible to the poor at those times. Next, consider how food displayed status through social behavior. In many societies, elite dining was formal and visible. Banquets, feasts, and public hospitality were ways to show dominance. The menu mattered, but so did the setting, seating order, serving staff, dishware, and the number of courses. Feasting could be a tool of rule. Leaders could gather allies, reward followers, and demonstrate their ability to command resources. This does not mean elites ate better in every way. Elite diets could also be heavy, repetitive in their own way, and shaped by fashion. But the key point is control. Elites could choose excess or restraint. Poor families often could not choose. Some places, governments tried to control display directly. Sumptuary laws attempted to limit luxury and keep social boundaries clear. These laws often focused on clothing, but they could also address dining, feasting, and household spending. The idea was that social rank should look like social rank. If wealthy merchants could imitate nobles through food and display, the line between classes could blur, which threatened the symbolic order. Even when these laws were not strongly enforced, they show that food display was politically important. Now focus on the countryside and the daily reality of food inequality. In many rural communities, people lived close to the edge. A normal year might mean enough calories, but limited variety. A bad year could mean hunger. Several pressures stacked on ordinary households. They owed rent or labor dues to landlords. They owed taxes to the state or local rulers. They might owe tithes to a church. They might have debt to local lenders or merchants. After those obligations, what remained might be just enough. This is why historians often speak of subsistence. It was not only a farming strategy, it was a social condition. Food inequality also took the form of vulnerability to shocks. Weather could ruin crops. Plant disease could spread. War could destroy fields or interrupt trade. Authorities could demand extra supplies for armies. Merchants could redirect grain to higher-paying markets. When shocks hit, the poor could be forced to sell tools, animals, or land. That would reduce their future ability to produce food, creating long-term poverty. Meanwhile, elites often had buffers. They had barns and granaries. They had multiple estates. They had legal power to collect dues. They had political influence to secure supplies. They could also profit from scarcity by selling grain at higher prices. This is why food is so central to the history of inequality. It is not only a matter of taste, it is a matter of risk, security, and power. Now move into the early modern period in Europe, where markets expanded. As trade networks grew, cities expanded, and governments became more centralized, food supply became more connected to prices and markets beyond the local village. This could bring advantages in good times, because food could be imported from elsewhere. But it also meant that local people could lose control of local supplies. When grain could be sold for higher profit in another region or abroad, local buyers might face scarcity and rising prices even if food existed in the wider system. This period also saw repeated episodes of food unrest. Crowds sometimes stopped shipments, pressured merchants, or forced sales at what they believed was a fair price. These actions reflected the belief that food was not just another commodity. It was a necessity tied to moral obligations. Governments sometimes intervened. They could ban exports. They could reduce duties on imports. They could regulate bread weights and prices. They could punish hoarding. These were early forms of food policy, and they show that authorities understood the link between bread and stability. But food policy often favored certain groups. Urban populations were politically sensitive, especially capital cities. Armies needed steady supply. Elites needed their households fed, so, in crisis, power often determined who received protection. Now consider another model of food and status: rice-centered systems in East Asia. In parts of Japan, for example, rice was not only a staple food, it was also a key unit of wealth and taxation. Samurai incomes were commonly measured in rice, and domain wealth could be assessed in rice equivalents. This meant status was closely linked to control of rice production and the flow of rice as revenue. In such a system, food and money were deeply connected. If your stipend is rice, your social position is literally expressed in food. If a domain's value is measured in rice yield, political rank is tied to agricultural output. This does not mean everyone ate rice equally. Diet could vary by region and class, and other grains mattered. But the symbolic power of rice shows how a staple can become the language of hierarchy. Now look at the industrial era, when inequality changed shape. Industrialization did not end food status, it reshaped it. More people moved to cities and depended on wages. They bought food instead of producing it. This made them vulnerable to job loss and price changes. At the same time, global trade expanded the supply of certain items like sugar, tea, coffee, and rice in some places, making them more common across classes. But common did not mean equal. Working-class diets in many industrial settings still depended heavily on bread or other staples. Meat remained a major dividing line, along with dairy and fresh produce. The issue was again not only taste, it was budget share. If bread takes most of the food budget, variety becomes a luxury. Industrial societies also developed new forms of food display. Restaurants, packaged goods, branded products, and new cooking technologies allowed the middle and upper classes to show refinement and modernity. Meanwhile, the poor often faced crowded housing, limited cooking fuel, and limited storage. That shaped diet as much as income did. Food inequality also appeared in public health. Diets heavy in cheap carbohydrates with limited protein and vitamins could support survival, but still produce long-term weakness and disease. Now return to the core question: how did food reflect social status, and how did inequality work? Across many historical periods, the patterns repeat. Staples fed everyone, but the elite added variety: animal products, sweets, and imported goods. The elite could eat fresh foods more often because they had faster access, better storage, and servants to manage preparation. The poor often relied on stretching food, mixing grains with legumes, using small amounts of fat for flavor, and using leftovers. The elite displayed status through feasts, hospitality, and specialized foods tied to rarity. The poor displayed respectability through basic sufficiency: enough bread, a bit of fat, maybe meat on special days. In addition, inequality was reinforced through institutions. Land systems determined who produced food and who extracted surplus. Tax systems moved food upward to elites and states. Market systems could shift food away from local needs toward profit. Legal and social rules marked what was proper for each rank. Charity and welfare systems helped some people survive, but often followed boundaries of citizenship, religion, or local belonging. Finally, food inequality must be understood as a daily experience. Status is often pictured as luxury, but for most people in the past, the main issue was security. Could you count on enough calories through the year? Could you survive the winter? Could you endure a bad harvest? Could you feed children and elders? For privileged groups, food status included choice and display. For ordinary groups, food status often meant something simpler: not being forced into hunger, not having to dilute meals, and not having to sell the tools of survival. In that sense, food is one of the clearest mirrors of historical inequality. It shows the structure of society in the most basic human need: who gets enough, who gets variety, who gets protection and who carries the risks. When we examine old menus, old market rules, old tax records, and old charity systems, we are not only learning what people ate, we are seeing how power was organized, how communities tried to manage fairness, and how social rank could be tasted at the table every day.